This is the second part of the discussion of cheese within the Kashrut Mythbusters series. So far, we've seen that in the time of the Talmud there was lack of clarity regarding the reason of the prohibition to consume cheese made by non-Jews. The consensus, however, with all the different arguments in the Talmud, seems to be that the prohibition had to do with some sort of non-kosher ingredient. That ingredient, according to some opinion, was related to idolatry. And as I mentioned in the previous class, if this is the case, then cheese made without non-kosher ingredients should be deemed kosher. And this was indeed the opinion of leading rabbis in medieval France. And apparently, there should be no reason why we should not follow their ruling today. What would be the argument against using the ingredients of the cheese as the yardstick for its qualification as kosher? The answer to this question is at the core of one of the most fundamental debates in Jewish law, a debate whose roots are in the Talmud, but which was crystallized in medieval times. And that is the question whether one can change, repeal, revoke a decree made by the rabbis of the Mishnah of the Talmud. So Maimonides writes in Hilchot Mamrim that which are the laws of the elder who rebels against the rabbinical court. So Rambam writes that if the rabbinical court created a decree, a regulation, or a practice, gezerah, takana, or minhag, and those have become widespread, a future court cannot undo their decision, even if the reason of said decree, regulation, or practice no longer exists, unless the later court is greater than the early one in both number of judges, number of members of the court, and in experience or wisdom. This is Rambam, Hilchot Mamrim, Perek Bet, Halacha Bet. And it says, בדין שגזרו גזירה או תקנו תקנה והנהיגו מנהג, ועמד בדין אחר לעקור דבריהם, אינו יכול עד שיהיה גדול מן הראשונים בחוכמה ובמניין. The Ravad, Rabbi Avraham ben David, who is the harshest critic of Rambam, writes on the spot, אמר אברהם, עיטור שווקי ירושלים בפירות קשה עליה, שהראשונים תקנו, ורבן יוחנן בן זכאי ביטלה אחר חורבן, מפני שנתבטל הטעם לראשונים, ולא היה גדול כראשונים. Ravad refutes Rambam's argument by showing a clear case of one of the greatest legislators of Mishnaic Judaism, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who, following the destruction of the temple, nullified the takana, the decree of bringing fruits to Yerushalayim as part of the Maaser. The details are not necessarily important now. The point is that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to override a decree that was created by generations before him, even though it was not as great as they were. And the reason he did that is that the original reason for the decree no longer existed. So already Rabbi Avraham ben David Ravad shows that the argument of Rambam, of Maimonides, that one cannot change the takana is problematic, and the commentators of Maimonides cannot provide a sufficient explanation to the case cited by the Ravad. But just to briefly talk about this rule before we get to the issue of cheese is we might say that the rule as Rambam phrased it, that one bedin cannot override the words of another bedin unless it's greater in number of members and in experience, originally applied to two courts that existed simultaneously in the same city or in the same country, and that would make sense that one of them would not be able to override the other, that the hierarchy will be given to the one which has more expertise and greater number of judges. But it would not make sense to apply this rule to courts that exist consecutively, because otherwise we will never give a later court the ability to discuss and to change decisions made by previous courts, especially following some of the rabbis who hold that we are always lesser than the previous generations. If we follow that, we will paralyze halakha without leaving room for innovation and accommodation for changing reality. But this is a matter for another discussion. What is important to our discussion now is that the prohibition of cheese made by non-Jews does not fall under any of the categories mentioned by Maimonides. A decree, gezerah, is usually gezerah to forbid something from to prevent something from happening. Takana is to fix an existing situation. Minhag is a practice. This is neither of all those three. It's a prohibition of consumption based on probably the ingredients in the cheese, and although the Mishnah did not provide full details, the Talmud Yerushalmi did. So this brings us to the discussion by the Tosafot, the authors of the commentary on the Talmud, the grandchildren of the Rashi and their disciples, and they discuss the text that I previously quoted from the Treket Avodah Zarah, where the Talmud suggests 6 different reasons for the prohibition. The Tosafot show that there is no reason to declare cheese as non-kosher other than the presence of non-kosher ingredients or dangerous ingredients. In that discussion, we find out that there were great scholars who allowed the consumption of cheese with vegetarian rennet made by non-Jews. So, if you want to see the Hebrew text of this Tosafot, it would be in Masechet Avodah Zarah, page 35, Amud Aleph, in Dibur HaMatchil Hadak Tanei. Now, I will translate here what the Tosafot say. First, he quotes Rabbeinu Tam, who says that now he means medieval France, we have no logical reason to forbid cheese made by non-Jews, since the reason for the original prohibition was the fear of snake bites. That reason was presented by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi overrides the opinions of all others. Meaning, Rabbeinu Tam says, since we have 6 opinions in the Talmud, one of them is Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is the one opinion that we follow. We follow Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and therefore the main reason for not eating cheese made by non-Jews is the fear that snakes bit the cheese while it was left outside to process in the mold. And since Rabbeinu Tam says, since there are no snakes where we live, there's no such concern and there's no prohibition. Definitely not in today's way of manufacturing and processing. He quotes also 2 of the leading Geonim, Rabbeinu Hanan and Seder Tanaim VaMoraim, who say that we always follow the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Then Tosafot goes on to say that the opinion of Rav Ada bar Ahava, that the cheese is forbidden because it is polished with lard, does not have any weight, cannot compete with the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. He also says that the other 2 opinions, that it has to do with non-kosher vinegar or sap, were refuted in the Talmud. Interestingly enough, he said the author of the Tosafot says that there is no concern about non-kosher milk being mixed into the cheese. This is mentioned in the Talmud in the name of Rav Hanina, since the non-Jews are not fools to do that, because they know that they will be caught, since it is known that non-kosher milk does not coagulate, does not turn into cheese. Now this, in parentheses, will say that this comment by Tosafot is a rebuke to the kosher industry, because the Tosafot clearly say you cannot make cheese from non-kosher milk. So there's no fear of non-kosher milk mixed in the cheese. When you label cheese as Halav Israel, you say that we have an added level of kashrut because you supervise the milk to make sure that it's kosher milk, but it's not necessary, because the moment you see cheese, you know that the cheese was made from kosher milk. This is tantamount to labeling water as fat-free or parv, dairy-free, etc. It never applies to water, so also Halav Israel never applies to cheese. But you slap the label on it, you could charge more money. Obviously, the only reason, say the Tosafot, is the fear of snake bites, which is not applicable where we live. Now, one cannot argue that the original prohibition was declared in through a vote in a Beit Din, and therefore cannot be refuted or changed unless you have a new session and voting by a greater rabbinical court, since it is obvious the original prohibition was limited only to cases where the fear of snake bites exists. And the Tosafot also tells us that they will deal with it when they come to the issue of kosher wine, which I hope also to do in the future. And finally, the Tosafot conclude that in many places, including specifically in Narbonne, the great rabbis of Narbonne, which is in Provence, France, ruled that cheese made with what they call prahim, meaning plant-based rennet, is kosher because the ingredients are kosher. However, in our place, say the Tosafot, which could be northern France or Germany, there is a problem that the actual stomachs of the calves are used to process the cheese, meaning they use pieces from the stomach, and that could be either dairy and meat, or in some places they use stomachs from pigs. And even though it's not cooked with the milk because they use a lot of salt, being salted together is considered as cooking. But the Tosafot, however, with all that, the Tosafot suggest that if we know exactly what are the ingredients in the cheese, then we can determine whether it's kosher or not. So two conclusions from this Tosafot. One, the only serious reason to consider cheese made by non-Jews as non-kosher is that they used to be exposed during the process and thus susceptible to contamination by snakes. Second, even if we accept the other opinions of the Talmud, that the prohibition is because of non-kosher ingredients, once we assert that all ingredients are kosher, so is the cheese. And so was the practice in many Jewish communities. People used to eat cheese made by non-Jews as long as they knew that the ingredients are kosher. I wish that people would be willing to follow Rabbeinu Tam, just as they follow Rabbeinu Tam regarding waiting an extra hour on Motzei Shabbat, or wearing 2 pairs of tefillin, and that the same rabbis who tell us, don't pick and choose your rabbi, don't pick and choose different halachic decisions by the same rabbi, would not pick and choose and follow Rabbeinu Tam in all of his rulings. In any case, the conclusion would be that since we've seen that the Mishnah mentions a prohibition against cheese made by non-Jews, and that the Talmud struggles to find a reason for the prohibition, we understand that there was some problem with the origins of the prohibition. There is an opinion that the prohibition should be upheld because of Maimonides says that the later court does not have the authority to change a decree. But to that we answer that, one, the opinion of Maimonides is challenged by the Ravad. Second, that Maimonides' statement refers to 3 specific types of rabbinical decision, and the prohibition of cheese does not fall under any of them. Third, the wide common practice in medieval France and Germany was to judge kashrut of cheese by its ingredients. The fact that it was made by non-Jews had no weight, and there was no hesitation to overrule the ancient prohibition. So, in conclusion, one can choose to be strict and to avoid non-supervised cheese, or one could choose to rely on the Ravad, Rabbeinu Tam, and the great scholars of Narbonne, as well as common sense, and determine the kashrut of cheese by its ingredients. Of course, you have to have more caution when dealing with artisanal cheese and small dairy farms. According to the second approach, all cheeses made with vegetarian rennet are kosher, because the ingredients are kosher. Animal-based rennet, which underwent this industrial process, has lost its status as food. It actually never had the status of food to begin with, and cheese made with it is also kosher, as we have seen in Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah. If one chooses, one is allowed to purchase cheese marked as kosher or Halav Israel, although the labeling, as previously explained, is somewhat misleading and the price is exorbitant. Bon appetit.